We are in an election year, almost certainly, but it's almost certain that at some point between now and the end of the year, this country will be going to the polls. So, with that, and those of you who are used to listening to me know that I tend to start with the state of the polls because that's what we do when we're in an election year. And YouGov had a poll out based on fieldwork in March, which shows Labour on 44 points now, and the Conservatives down at 19. And remarkably, and this is what has really set the sort of cat amongst the pigeons, is that Reform are polling at 15 points now. And I'll talk about what the implications of that are, but even the Lib Dems are down at 9. These kinds of numbers, if you crudely transform them into a uniform national swing and kind of project that into what that would look like in Parliament if that election was held tomorrow, puts Labour on an absolutely gigantic majority. And the worry now for the Conservatives is that Reform could, if this continues, actually be outpolling them before summer. So this is where you will hear some commentators talk about an extinction level event for the Conservatives. Now, I don't think that will happen, but it's an extremely concerning poll for the Tories. Meanwhile, Labour can't quite believe that they're this far ahead. And my boss tends to talk about Keir Starmer sort of holding this Ming vase. They don't want to drop it. They can't quite believe they're that far ahead. They don't think the polls are quite right. They think something's going to go wrong. But, and I guess we're all used to upsets over the last few years, but it may just be this time as simple as it looks, that Labour are polling a long way ahead. The public's not totally sold on Keir Starmer. They're not totally into him. The background polling on him as an individual is very, very mediocre or poor. But if there's a driving force in this election and in the polling, it's kind of get the Tories out, give the other guys a go. So that leads to a speculation about the date of an election. And if you read the newspapers, you'll have seen May put out there, June put out there, October put out there, November put out there. The truth is that there's probably only 2 people in the country that really know when the election's going to be. One of them's Rishi Sunak, and the other one's his elections advisor, Isaac Levido, possibly 1 or 2 other advisors. And initially, there was some speculation that he would maybe go for an early election on May the 2nd. He's ruled that out. So we know it's not going to be May the 2nd, but it's possible it could happen before the summer. The most likely date, or the most likely timing, most people are sort of speculating on at the moment, is October. There's a general view that the government or the Prime Minister wouldn't want to have an election to clash with the US elections in November. Now, what's the government's strategy? Well, they had hoped that the green shoots of economic recovery would give them some credit. Okay, that was always Rishi's plan, to kind of hold your nerve, see inflation come down, see a bit of growth in the economy. That the remarks from the governor of the Bank of England yesterday were helpful in that regard. The problem is I think the government's getting no benefit of the doubt. It's seeing no particular payback from anything. The budget was supposed to be, a moment where, you had the 2p cut in national insurance, and that would be a sort of bit of a reset, maybe a bit of a pre-election budget, a moment where the Tories could say, look, we're beginning to be able to cut taxes, hold the line, but the public's just not really listening anymore. I think that's the kind of general sense that we get. So that's beginning to cause panic within the Conservative Party. Every so often you'll see some wing of the party saying maybe we should get rid of the Prime Minister. At these poll levels, it's actually worth the risk. And I think a few months ago, when this was being talked about, the view was that the risks were too high, that chucking a leader at this point was too late, that it would be really disruptive, and that the public would punish the Conservative parties for binning another leader. But when you're polling at 19 and Reform are at 15, that changes that calculus, and maybe it is worth the risk of changing horses, even at this incredibly late stage. Now, that led to Rishi's team, or the Prime Minister's team, sort of briefing, well, if you try it, we'll just go to the polls. and we'll run an election. So there's this sort of very strange and uncomfortable standoff within the party. At the same time, we're also seeing very large numbers of MPs stand down. At this election, there's going to be a big turnover. I think there's well over 100 who have already said that they're going to stand down at this election across the parties. So when you look at the number of MPs who are standing down because they just don't want to fight this election because they're going to lose, and then you take in all the new Labour MPs who could potentially be coming in, the next parliament's going to look a lot different in complexion to the one that we have now. Okay, so that's enough about the sort of political speculation. I just wanted to talk about policy as well, and something that obviously a lot of our clients are very interested in, which is what does Labour, if it is going to form the next government, what does Labour look like in power? And Labour has worked very hard to build the confidence of the business community over the last couple of years, things like going to Davos, the infrastructure council they built. So there's been this very concerted effort by Labour to try to get the business community on side, to try and make the case that Britain will be investable under a Labour government after all the damage that was done to UK confidence by the prospect of a Corbyn government. But that said, a Labour government will feel different and it will look different. So one of the more helpful expositions of what Labour and government might look like was Rachel Reeves-May's lecture earlier this week. So this is a very big, long speech, 8,000 words, took her an hour to deliver it. And that was her spelling out the economic ideas, the economic mindset of her as Chancellor and what a Labour government would look like. Now, I'm going to say at the outset, there was nothing new in policy terms in this speech, but it was probably the single most coherent exposition of Labour's economic policy, and was the first time it had been set out in such great length in one place. Because the way that Labour makes policy is it's all a big negotiation. You've got the unions, you've got the CLPs, you've got all these different actors, the NEC, and what they do is when they decide policy, it's this big process that ends up with a manifesto at some point. So it's not like the Conservative Party where the leader can kind of change the manifesto as they want. So when she was giving that speech, it was all policy that had broadly been agreed. But I think what's interesting here is the way that she explained what Labour would do in government. So what are the contours? What are the contours of that? So firstly, broadly, a commitment to conservative orthodoxy on tax and spend day to day. So a commitment to not borrowing to fund day-to-day expenditure. In other words, to continue deficit reduction and to try and get GDP debt falling as a proportion of GDP by the end of the 5 years. So broadly a commitment to the fiscal envelope that's been set by the Conservative Party. The difference is, and the reason they're doing that is to not end up with a kind of market reaction like Liz Truss had with the mini budget. So it's saying to the markets, you can trust us, we're grown-ups, but there is a different view on investment. There is going to be a different approach to borrowing to fund capital expenditure. The Conservatives never quite got there, but this will be done in a couple of ways. Firstly, by building the growth team within HM Treasury, so there's going to be an extra 250 officials there, and they're also going to ask the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, to calculate the impact of capital investment differently, to try and price the long-term costs of not investing in our capital stock. And in that respect, I think Labour have been quite inspired by Bidenomics and the Inflation Reduction Act, and this idea of using the sort of state's firepower to prime and boost industry. The difference, of course, between the US and the UK is that we are not as rich as the US. And that's the real challenge that she faces, that even though I think there's a view that the UK should invest more, there's an open question about where the money's going to come from. And that's a big challenge, particularly when, if you look at what the Conservative spending plans look like, there's a lot of cuts that have been pushed back into the next Parliament. So they're going to have to deal with this tension. One of the routes that they're really focusing on is bringing investment money in from DC pensions so the UK has got a couple of £1 trillion in pension vehicles of certain forms. DB schemes are difficult to tap because of the way that their investments or their holdings are structured, but DC pension pots are growing. So the idea is that there would be more invested in the UK from DC schemes. There is also a big, and I'll wrap up shortly, there is also a big, in her mindset, focus on stability. This trade-off between freedom and security, the state being more focused on building resilient supply chains, a resilience within the economy, and making sure that the country is insulated against supply side shocks like the ones we saw after the pandemic. That's quite a different from conservative orthodoxy. Another two places where I think Labour does very significantly differ is the extent to which they want to bake climate policy into our financial and economic system. Rishi Sunak has definitely gone cool on net zero. He thinks it's expensive, it's a brake on growth. He's not especially interested in it. Under a Labour government, that agenda goes right back to the top again. Decarbonisation, investment in renewable energy, targets to decarbonise the economy, and using the financial system and the Bank of England to push that agenda. And another place where I think Labour will feel quite different is on the issue of workers' rights. The Conservative Party, the Keir Starmer needs the support and goodwill of the unions. The quid pro quo is, we will let you run a more orthodox, sort of, shall I say, slightly right of centre orthodoxy in economic policy, but the payback is that there has to be stuff on workers' rights. And if you look at the most developed part of the Labour agenda, where they've spelt out most of what they're going to do, it is actually in the field of workers' rights. So that's about things like what they would call insecure working, the gig economy. It's things like right to switch off. It's things like restoring trade union rights, which have been curtailed by the Conservative government. So I think, if I'm going to leave with you with one thought, yes, the Labour Party is working very hard to bring business along, but there will be spaces in which there will be there will be an uncomfortable tension between what Labour wants to do and what business wants to promote UK competitiveness. So I will wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Edward.